Let's continue with this flow chart right here. And we're taking a look at the factors that are influencing your mean arterial pressure. I want you to focus on the side here to the left. The cardiac output is the product of heart rate times the stroke volume. And the heart rate is actually pretty easy because the autonomic nervous system is controlling that. And there you have sympathetic and parasympathetic input, which that's influenced by hormones, electrolytes, body temperature, and brain. But the autonomic nervous system is fairly straightforward. So you have sympathetic input, which increases heart rate, and parasympathetic input, which decreases heart rate. Now, let's take a look at the stroke volume. This is where it's not so simple. The stroke volume is determined by how much blood comes back from the venous side of the circulation. That will determine your end diastolic volume. So you need venous return. You need blood to come back. Well, who's making sure that blood is coming back? It's mostly the respiratory pump, which is your diaphragm contracting every time you breathe, and your skeletal muscle pump, where we're running our veins through the muscular tissue, and it's every time it's contracting, it's pushing some blood up towards the right side of the heart. Now, the fluid factors, the amount of fluid that's in circulation, that will be the job of the kidneys to determine that and to control that. And the kidney, in turn, is controlled by various hormones, for example, the angiotensin, the aldosterone, and the antidiuretic hormone. So you can see here is where it's starting to get kind of complicated because you have so many factors that are playing a role. Also, the total peripheral resistance, that is determined by the blood vessel diameter basically, and the factors that are listed right here. But I really want you to focus on the mean arterial pressure being determined by the cardiac output, which is the product of heart rate and stroke volume, is determined by these factors over here. All of this here on the left side of this diagram. Now let's take a look at the arterial resistance. That means basically the blood vessel diameter on the arterial side of your circulation. And we have both local and systemic control mechanisms. So we have sympathetic reflexes, we have hormones that play a role, and then local factors that can also control the blood vessel diameter. So here's a list of these chemicals that are mediating vasoconstriction and vasodilation. On the vasoconstriction side, you can take a look at serotonin, norepinephrine, of course, and angiotensin 2, vasopressin as well. So those would be some factors that will decrease the blood vessel diameter. On the vasodilation side, we have acetylcholine from the parasympathetic side. Very strong vasodilator is nitric oxide, bradykinin, adenosine, histamine. All of these are playing a role. The atrial natriuretic peptide is also playing a role, so this will be down here. So these are factors that are contributing to the final diameter of blood vessels. Here you have an example of how norepinephrine works on blood vessel diameter. So here we have our sympathetic neuron over here, and it's of course dropping norepinephrine, and it's binding to alpha receptors. Now, depending on the signaling rate, we're going to have two different outcomes here. If we're increasing the norepinephrine release, so that would be a fight and flight kind of response. Now we're having increased release here of the norepinephrine onto the alpha receptors, and that will decrease the blood vessel diameter. You can see how the blood vessel diameter is very small here. Now here we have decreasing the norepinephrine release onto the alpha receptors, and you can see how the blood vessel diameter is increasing. We have less firing here of these signals. And so this decrease of norepinephrine has a relaxing effect and opening effect of these of the blood vessel. And this flow chart here summarizes the flow. So the flow would be being determined by the pressure and the resistance, The pressure gradient here is mostly determined by the mean arterial pressure and the some other factors that you can see right here. And the resistance to flow is basically the blood vessel diameter, which is also controlled by various types of factors. Now let's take a look at the distribution of blood in the body at rest. So the biggest concern for your body would be to deliver enough blood to the brain and to the heart itself. So the brain and the blood, they must always get very fresh blood supply and a continuous blood supply, no compromises. The liver also gets a good amount, and the kidneys, skeletal muscle, skin, bone, and other tissues, so they all have their distributions. Now, once you exercise, a lot of things change. When you exercise, you need to divert more blood into the skeletal tissue and skeletal muscle tissue, and you can take away from the gastrointestinal tract, or maybe from the kidneys a little bit, from bones and other tissues. So depending on the situation, you can divert blood more toward one area as opposed to another, but there are two organs that must be supplied first, and that would be brain and heart, two vital organs. Now, if you decide that you want to divert blood, then you always have the option of increasing or decreasing blood vessel diameter. So here's the example given that you have 4 liters per minute, some cardiac output, and you're servicing equally areas A, B, C, and D. They all get 1 liter per minute, and it adds up to the total cardiac output of 4 liters per minute. Now we're deciding that area B is not a concern at this moment, and we need to reduce blood flow. So we're decreasing the blood vessel diameter right here. It's only getting 1/4 of a liter per minute. That means now we have 3/4 of a liter that we can distribute into other areas, and in this case, area A, C, and D are getting the additional 1/4 liter of blood, and it still adds up to your 4 liters per minute. That kind of a redistribution of blood flow is exactly what happens when you are exercising. So in exercise, you're going to have an increased cardiac output, and you want an increased blood flow to skeletal muscles because they're working hard right now. So how do we achieve this? The cardiac output is determined by the cardiac rate, heart rate, times the stroke volume. We're going to up both. We're going to increase the heart rate. We're going to increase the stroke volume. And then we have some other factors here. We're going to be deeper breathing and improving the venous return, and all of that helps us with achieving a higher cardiac output, with the goal being that we want more blood flow to skeletal muscle. So here is an example given. And at rest, let's take a look at rest first. Down here at rest, we have our 5 liters per minute cardiac output, and it's distributed in the following ways: 20 to 25% here for the gastrointestinal tract, 4 to 5% for the heart, 20% for the kidneys, bones get something, the brain is getting 15% of that cardiac output, and the skin 4 to 5%. So it all adds up, and your muscles are getting 15 to 20%. Skeletal muscle gets 15 to 20% of that cardiac output at rest of 5 liters per minute. Now we do heavy exercise. What's going to happen? Our cardiac output is now 25 liters per minute. How do we achieve that? We up the heart rate, we up the stroke volume, we improve the venous return, we breathe deeper, all of those things. And now 80 to 85% of that cardiac output of 25 liters is going to skeletal muscle tissue because we are doing heavy exercise. So these guys, they need to get a lot of oxygen and fresh blood supply. So they're getting 20 liters per minute alone. By proportion, even though it says here 3 to 4% of the cardiac output as opposed to 15% for the brain at rest, the amount is still the same. The brain basically gets a constant amount of oxygenated blood and nutrients that it needs to meet its whatever it needs to do. Now let's take a look at the heart. The heart was getting 4 to 5% of the cardiac output when it was at 5 liters per minute. It's still getting 4 to 5% now that we're in heavy exercise. So that means the heart is working harder, it's pumping faster and stronger, and so it needs to get a little bit more blood overall, so total amount. So it's still getting 4 to 5% of a new cardiac output of 25 liters per minute. The gastrointestinal tract is missing out. It's still getting a good amount of blood, but by comparison, it used to get 20 to 25% of your cardiac output at rest. It's only getting 3 to 5% of the cardiac output at when you're doing heavy exercise. So here you can just see that the diversion of blood is meeting the demand of what you're doing. So you're doing heavy exercise. Of course, the tissue that works the hardest needs to get the most. That would be your skeletal muscle tissue. And you can divert blood into the direction where it is being needed the most. Now let's take a look at the regulation of the cardiovascular function. And you have something called the Cardiovascular Control Center, the CVCC, Cardiovascular Control Center. And basically what's going on in your cardiovascular system is being reported to this control center, and any adjustments will be made in that control center. That control center is in your brainstem, and if anything would ever happen to that control center, you would not do well at all. Also, the baroreceptor reflex, that is basically a report of the pressure situation, blood pressure that is, in your cardiovascular system, and that will cause changes to the diameter of blood vessels if needed. So the baroreceptor reflex right here. So let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at the aortic arch right here. So we do have, so this is where the major pressure vessels are. So you have the major gush of blood coming out of the left ventricle, and now it's going into the aortic arch. You have baroreceptors in the aortic arch. You also have baroreceptors in the carotid sinuses right around here in your neck area, and that will report the whatever the pressure that's measured here will be reported back to the cardiovascular control center here in the brain stem region right here, and then a response will be sent either via sympathetic or parasympathetic neurons. So you have parasympathetic right here and sympathetic right here. Here we have the whole process in steps, and in your aortic arch right here and in the carotid sinuses you have baroreceptors. They measure blood pressure. They will sense any change in blood pressure and report that to the brain stem. So here any kind of change in blood pressure will be reported to the cardiovascular control center. And once the cardiovascular control center has received that information, it will make a decision of what needs to be done, and it will activate either parasympathetic neurons or sympathetic neurons, depending on what your body needs at that time. And then you will basically be adjusting your blood vessel diameter in order to meet the need of compensating any change in blood pressure. The parasympathetic or sympathetic neurons, of course, they will be affecting the SA node and either accelerate the next depolarization wave or decelerate it. So, of course, the parasympathetic side will decrease heart rate, and the sympathetic neurons, they would increase heart rate. And here you have a diagram showing sort of a flow chart, the baroreceptor reflex again. Here the scenario is that we have an increase in blood pressure, and of course that's being sensed by these baroreceptors, sent to the cardiovascular control center, and then the cardiovascular control center either makes a decision to activate sympathetic or parasympathetic side. So it would be, in this case, of an increase in blood pressure, we want to decrease the sympathetic side and increase the parasympathetic side, relax things and try to ease the pressure. And then you can take a look at some of the factors down here, but the goal would be to decrease blood pressure.